Hey guys, welcome back to Bry Guy Garage. I'm Brian, and today we're going to be taking a quick look, and I'm going to be giving you a few quick tips on installing cam bearings. So some of you that may have been following along already may already be familiar with this block. This is the 355 Small Block Chevy that came out of my 73 Camaro. I had a recent video where it was pretty much a full teardown of this block while I was getting ready to clean it out and give it a hone. So the block is completely cleaned. The cylinders have all been honed with a flex hone by Brush Research Manufacturing. I absolutely love their flex hones. I have a video on using one of those as well. So the cylinders look great. The block is cleaned. So now it's time to put the cam bearings in. Okay, so before we get into it, there's one very important piece of information that you need to know. And that is that the small block cam bearing journals, or the bores rather, are not all bored to the same exact size. So we're gonna use the very front one as number 1 and the very last one as number 5. So front of the block is 1 and the very rear of the block is 5. So you'll get your cam bearings in a box such as this. For me, I'm using Mall and Cleveite bearings. As you'll notice, I already have some of them installed because some of them are missing. So for the cam bearing bore sizes, I have it written down, and it is as follows. Number 1, again, the front, is 2.020 inches. Number 2 and number 5 are both 2.010 inches. And lastly, number 3 and number 4 are 2 inches even. So you want to make sure that you have the proper cam bearing going into the right bore of the block. Otherwise you're gonna ruin the bearing, or it's not gonna be the right size and it's just gonna be flopping around in there. So these need to go in to the proper position. For my bearings here, they already came positioned from 1 through 5, left to right, as you can see that I have numbered here. However, I still took every single bearing out and used a pair of veneer calipers to measure each one. And then before I placed it back in the block, I took a Sharpie and just quickly wrote which position it goes into. That way, when I'm going to install it and I place it in the cam bearing installation tool, I can verify once again that I have the right bearing in my hand. Additionally, there's some differing opinions across engine builders and enthusiasts how to clock the bearing. And by clock, I mean the positioning of it, because your cam bearing is going to have an oil feed hole, such as this one that you can see on the bottom. And some people say that they line them up hole to hole with the feed hole. If we take a look up in here, you can see there is a hole here. And some people say just line them up hole to hole and let the oil flow right through. However, the cam bearing manufacturers suggest that you take that hole and you position it around the 2 o'clock position. So I'm gonna go with what the cam bearing manufacturers suggest. They suggest that this is the best position due to the thrust of the cam, where it's gonna be thrusting most onto the bearing itself, and you kind of want to create an oil wedge on that area to prevent excessive wear. Now, this isn't something that I believe is going to be make or break in an engine build. However, it does seem like it's going to dictate how long your bearings last. Another quick thing to note, I'm showing you everything right now with the engine upright, how it would be sitting in the car. The cam bearings are going to be installed with the engine upside down because it is far easier to see what's going on from underneath as opposed to up top. From underneath, you can see just how far you're driving in the cam bearings and making sure that you get them in the right position. So the last thing that I did with the engine upright, if you look here, I took a Sharpie and made a mark at the 2 o'clock position, as I mentioned. This is where we're gonna want the oil feed hole to sit. With the block upright, we want them all installed at about the 2 o'clock position. So I made my mark there, and then I took every bearing that's in the kit, and I'm gonna use that as a reference. So I took each bearing, lined the oil feed hole up with that 2 o'clock mark, like so. I may not be spot on right now because I'm only using one hand. But once I have that oil feed hole at 2 o'clock, then I made another mark at the very bottom center, so the 6 o'clock position. Made a little mark there, pulled the bearing out, and then I went ahead and drew a line straight across for that mark. And now I'll show you why. After that, I went ahead and turned the block upside down. I then grabbed a small metal straight edge that I had, and I took a white paint pen and made some additional marks on the webbing right next to each cam bore. So really all I want out of these marks is for them to just be centered with the cam bore and be straight up and down. This is going to be another reference mark that I'm going to be lining the cam bearing mark up to. Basically, this is going to ensure that I keep the clock position that I want and that oil feed hole is going to stay at that 2 o'clock position. So when I go to drive this cam bearing in, you'll see it a little easier on this one, I can keep the line on the bearing lined up with the paint pen line on the webbing. That'll keep the cam bearing in the position that I want. Now there's one more aspect of positioning the cam bearing that we're going to want to pay attention to, and that is the depth of how far we're driving the bearing in. If we take a look here at the cam bearing bore, we can see that there's this groove in the very center of the bore, and that is where the oil is going to be passing through. You can see there's a oil feed hole here that goes to the top of the block. There's also an oil feed hole here at the bottom, which is coming from the main bearings and the main up here. So the oil is going to be traveling through that groove. So when we drive in the cam bearing into the bore, we're going to want to make sure that this oil feed hole for the bearing is somewhere near the center of that groove. If you don't drive it in far enough, or if you drive it in too far, you're going to create a blockage, and that can restrict oil flow. For people that are lining them up just oil feed hole to oil feed hole, you can pretty much just look down through the hole here with a flashlight and you'll see that it's going right through, and you can see that they're lined up. However, since I'm using the 2 o'clock cam bearing manufacturer recommended positioning, you can't do that in this case. So again, that's why I have all these lines and all these marks to ensure that we have them lined up properly. However, that is not going to allow us to see how far in we have it driven, whether it's in too far, or if it's not in far enough, or if it's just right. So I kind of have a cheap trick here that allows me to be able to tell that I have it positioned at least somewhat close to center with that groove in the bore. So here I have a couple sets of Allen wrenches, and I went and found one that fits just snugly into the oil feed hole, like so. There's really not a lot of wiggle room, it just fits in there. And I'll show you what I'm going to do with this. So as you're driving a cam bearing in, for the 1 through 4 position, you can kind of eyeball when it's just about right, because this lip here for the bore will be just about even on each side. You can kind of see that chamfer. It'll be just about even, and that's how you know that you're kind of center. However, I like to know a little better than that, just to be sure, because it's kind of hard to see up in that hole. And for the very last one back here, number 5, this one gets driven in further because the bore is just a different size back here. So you're not really going to be able to eyeball it like that. So what I do is I use this Allen key. As I had mentioned, this Allen key just fits through that oil feed hole in the bearing. And if we take a look here at the front of the block, and we look at the groove that's in that bearing, that's in the bore rather, we can see that there's plenty of room for the end of this Allen key to fit in as well. So what I'm using this for is to check whether that feed hole is centered with the groove. So if the Allen key slips through the hole in the bearing and sits in a little bit further, I know that I'm sitting in the groove. However, if I take the Allen key and I go to insert it through the hole in the bearing and it really doesn't go through at all, I know that I'm still not centered. So I'm going to use this one as an example here to show you. If we take a look, see that? We have plenty of depth where that Allen key sits in. That way I know it's going through the bearing and it's sitting inside that groove in the bore. And of course, we can just visually observe the oil feed hole as we're driving the cam bearing in to ensure that it's positioned properly. However, my eyes have lied to me before, and the Allen key thing is just a trick that I like to use. It's obviously a lot easier to see it on camera with a flashlight when it's zoomed in. So, whatever you're most comfortable with. Here is the cam bearing installation tool that I will be using. I got this off of Amazon, and I've used it a few times and it's worked just fine every time. And it's definitely not as expensive as some of the professional style designs that some engine shops will be using, where you can insert different dies on the end of them so it's the proper size depending on what engine you're working on. This one here is specifically for a small block Chevy, so it's not going to work on a Ford, it's not going to work on a Mopar. I'll show you the basics of using this tool in a moment, but since I already installed number 3, 4, and 5, I just want you to know that you're going to start with installing number 5, and you're going to go from the front of the block all the way through each cam bearing bore to number 5. And then you're going to hit that in this way. You're going to strike it through towards the back of the block. And then you move up to 4 and 3 and so on. So now I'm going to insert the cam tool just to give you an idea of how the cam is used. The tool, not the cam. Okay, so on this cam bearing tool, this is going to be the end that you're striking. And up here, you're going to be inserting your cam bearing into this side. It's going to fit, or it should fit, just snug, and that rubber seal is going to keep it in place. And then this bigger diameter chunk of the driver here is what's going to hit the face of the bearing and actually drive it in. Further down on the tool, you see this bit, the tapered bit. This is going to help you locate the tool itself to ensure that you're not too far cockeyed either way as you're going to hit it in, because you want this to be straight as possible as you're hitting it in. You don't want to end up hitting the bearing in sideways and having it going uneven or get stuck and wedged. So I'll just show you a quick example of this from outside on the front of the block. So the next cam bearing that I need to install is in the number 2 position right here. So I would be inserting the tool in like so. You're going to be inserting the tool first before you put the bearing on, which I'll show when I actually go to put these bearings in. So I would bring the front of the tool just up to the front of the number 2 position. And the main thing I want you to focus on right now is this piece. This will be resting in the number 1 cam bore up here, and that's what's going to keep it level and true. Watch, if I take this tool out, the whole bar drops down. Without this piece here locating it, it's pretty much up to you to guess exactly where center and straight is, and you're just pretty much, it's a crapshoot from there. So the second you bring this in, it's going to locate it and keep it centered, and that'll ensure that you're driving the bearing in straight. So when you're using the tool, I advise keeping one hand on this piece to make sure that it stays in, and you're going to be hitting the opposite side with the hammer as you're driving it in. Oftentimes, if you let go of this, it just comes right out. So definitely keep a good grip on that and make sure it stays in place so everything is straight and true. Now that you have an idea of the tool, I'm going to get a good angle and show you guys the installation itself. Another very important thing to keep in mind right now. Remember when we made our marks, when the block was still upright? We had this in about the 2 o'clock position, and then we made our mark on the bottom and drew our line across. Now we're going to be lining that line up with the line here on the webbing that we made with the straight edge. So if you had been holding your cam bearing the same exact way the whole time, you'd have no problems and it would be positioned just fine as you go to drop it in. However, the block is upside down now. So if all you're doing is looking at that line, you may not have noticed that at some point you may have flipped the bearing like this. And if you did that, now all you're going to be doing is focusing on this line, and maybe you didn't look at the feed hole. So when you line up, line the line, and you go to knock that bearing in, and look what happens. Your oil feed hole is now in the wrong spot. Because now if the block is upside down, it's no longer the 2 o'clock position, it's the 8 o'clock position. So before you go to drive this cam bearing in, bring it down, get that line straight up and down, and take a look at what side your oil feed hole is on. In my case, this is on the right side right now, and that puts it at about the 2 o'clock position with the block upside down. That is incorrect. So we'll flip this around. Again, we will take a look at that line. We'll line it up. Oil feed hole is on my left side. That's 8 o'clock, which means it'll be in the 2 o'clock position with the block upright. That is the correct position. So now I'm going to take the bearing and I'm going to take my installation tool. I took a little WD-40 and oiled up the O-ring here to make sure that it slips out easily when I'm done driving it in. So I'm going to insert the cam bearing tool in through the front of the block. And we can see here, now it's just in front of number 2. If you were going to be doing number 3 or any of the ones further back, for example, you need to pass it through each of those cam bearing bores. It's not going to go through this one because it has the bearing in, but you'd have to bring it all the way to the back of the block and then take this piece, as I showed you, and center it and drive the bearing in. But we're up to number 2 now, so we're going to keep it right in front of the number 2 bearing bore, and we'll take our bearing, we'll get it lined up. You have to kind of turn it sideways a little bit to get it in there. I know you can't see it too well now, but I'm going to do this again zoomed in a moment. And then you're going to install it onto the front of the cam bearing tool. And then finally, you would make sure that it's lined up, line to line, and then you're going to strike it for the first time to get it seated. So I'm going to take all this out again and bring you in close so you can get a good look. Okay, so here we are zoomed in nice and close. Number 2 cam bearing bore right here. So I got the bearing in my left hand. And if we line it up with the mark that I have, the oil feed hole is on the left side, which puts it at about the 8 o'clock position, so our positioning is correct. The bearing is not flipped around. So with my other hand, I'm going to insert the cam bearing tool in through the front of the block, and we're going to bring the cam bearing down on a bit of an angle, turn it, and now let's get it onto the cam bearing tool itself. I have a little bit of WD-40 on the O-ring for the cam bearing tool, as well as on the inside of the cam bearing itself, but I do not have any oil or WD-40 on the outside of the bearing because I want this to go in dry. Okay, that's pretty good. It should seat itself the rest of the way once I start to do the initial seating. So now I have both hands on the cam bearing tool, and I'm gonna bring it just up to the front of that cam bearing bore, and I'm gonna check my line again. My lines are pretty well lined up to one another. Now I have my left hand holding the tapered part of the tool up into the number 1 cam bearing bore in the front to make sure that that stays centered and true, and that my lines stay lined up, and that this isn't going to spin too much on me now. And now I'm going to make sure this is pushed all the way forwards into that position on the block. With my other hand, I'm going to reach for my hammer, and I'm going to take my first hit to seat that bearing. So at that point, I have it started. I'm gonna check. Looks like it's going in straight so far. We're gonna keep hitting it. Again, stop, take a look. Doesn't appear to be cockeyed. Looks like it's going in straight. My lines stayed pretty much lined up with one another. Sometimes it turns a little bit. It's still okay, as long as you're not way off. You're still in that 2 o'clock area. Keep driving it in. So I'm gonna stop real quick just to show you guys something. Obviously, if you take a look, that doesn't look right. Shouldn't be stopping there. It's protruding out of the cam bore a ton. But I'm gonna get in close here to show you guys something. Take a look at that oil feed hole. It is clearly blocked. The groove is not behind it. That is just the steel of the bore itself behind it. So if you don't drive this into the proper position, no oil is going to be going to this bearing. It's going to get destroyed immediately. All right, let's keep driving it in. Stop and take a look. We're getting close, and this gives us another good opportunity to stop and take a look at something once again. Now take a look at the oil feed hole again. You see what almost looks like a line kind of on the left towards the center of the oil feed hole? We're just starting to pass the leading edge of that groove that's inside the bore. So looking at this, we know that we're still not centered with that oil groove. So we're going to drive it in some more. Felt that one go a decent amount. So let's take a look. Still a little bit more. All right, at this point, we're very close. If you look through that oil feed hole from the side of the block, you can see that there are no blockages. However, there's a little bit more to go. And I can tell that from looking at the lip on each side of the bearing. There's still a little more room towards the back. So I'm going to drive this back just a little bit. Those hits were not as strong that time because I'm very close and I don't want to overshoot it. And from a quick look, that looks about right. So now if we take a look, this is what I meant by that lip. Next to the edge of the bearing, this is the bore. That looks pretty even with the amount that's showing on this side. So the bearing does appear to be centered in the bore itself. So now I'm going to take that Allen key and see how that fits. Okay, so now I have the Allen key. We're going to very carefully approach the feed hole with the Allen key. We don't want to scratch the bearing. I have it in, and see how far in that goes? I know that I'm clearing the bearing itself, going through the bearing completely and into that groove that's in the center of the cam bore. So I know I will not have any restrictions, and the oil is going to flow freely through the back of that bearing. So you may have noticed while we were zoomed in close on the bearing there that there was some junk on the surface, and mostly that is just the WD-40 and the WD-40 reacting with the rubber seal that's on the cam bearing installation tool. So I'm going to wipe all that off now with a nice clean towel, and the cam bearing looks good and it feels good. These Babbitt bearings are shipped with a protective tin coating on them, and they're very soft. you can even take your fingernail and pretty much scratch through the tin coating that's on them. It's just there for shipping so it doesn't rust. And as I said, it's really soft, so if you're not careful with the cam bearing installation tool, if you go to take it out and maybe you twist it up or down or in any direction, you might catch it a little bit and you might put a little scratch in it. But as long as you only lightly scratch that tin coating and you don't actually scratch through the substrate of the bearing itself, you should be fine. So just be careful, keep everything straight, and make sure you feel everything, take a close look at everything when you're done. So now I'm gonna do a quick check that I do after I install each cam bearing. And I'm gonna take an old cam that I have here that's in good condition. You don't wanna use one that's trashed, otherwise you're just gonna be installing this and then you're gonna ruin your brand new bearings. I have some WD-40 on the new cam bearings, as well as on the cam journals itself. Never put anything in like this dry, you'll scratch your bearings up right away. And what I'm doing here is just making sure that this new bearing didn't get installed cockeyed or crooked or in any way that's going to be pinching the cam or making it tight. I did this after each cam bearing installation, after number 5, number 4, number 3, and now you're seeing me doing it on number 2. So with that lubricated and with the cam in position, you gotta watch the front. Obviously I don't have the front end, but it's being balanced on pretty much everything else. And with everything lubed, I'm able to rotate this cam nice and easily. So I know that this new bearing that I just put in number 2 wasn't installed in such a way that is affecting cam rotation. You do that after each bearing, so you know that, okay, let's say you put 5 in and you put the camshaft in, it turns just fine. Then you put 4 in, put the camshaft in, still turns just fine. Then you put number 3 in, and now all of a sudden it's tight and it seems to be catching for some reason. Well, you do number 5 and number 4 were fine, so now your issue is with number 3. At that point, you have to kind of look at things and see if you might have to end up doing the bearings again. But it's just a pre-assembly check to make sure that you're not going to run into any issues when it's fully assembled. So now I'm going to take that cam back out and get the front one done. Okay, so with the rest of the cam bearings installed, that leaves us with the very front number 1 cam bearing. And something that I forgot to mention earlier, on a small block Chevy, as you see here, the number 1 cam bearing has 2 oil feed holes. So with the block upside down, as we've been installing the cam bearings, these oil feed holes are going to be positioned in the 4 and 8 o'clock position, like so, with that line going straight up. So 4 and 8 o'clock. Before we continue, I just want to make a quick note about the front cam bearing. We've been installing each cam bearing, driving it from the front towards the back of the block. However, if you look here at the number 1 bearing here in the front, you'll notice an issue. If we continue installing it in that manner, we do not have a bore to locate the tool on with this tapered piece. So what machine shops and I guess professionals use, they'll have that tool that I described earlier. It has the different dies for them to use for different applications, and it'll often have different size bars that attach to that. So in this case, most likely what would be used is a small stubby bar that attaches to the die on the end. It's a lot easier to locate it and to keep it straight and true and just to hit it straight in. Whereas here, we're dealing with an almost 2.5 to 3 foot bar, and it's going to be much more difficult to actually keep that level and straight. And if you deviate even in the slightest bit and just go a little bit off to one side, you're gonna hit that bearing in cockeyed. And these bearings are interference fit, which is why we're driving them in. So if you have one cockeyed a little bit and you really start to hammer that in, you're gonna end up crushing it in the wrong spot, and then you're gonna have to knock it back out. And at that point, I would just wanna use a new bearing. So what we're gonna do here is go from the back of the block and knock that bearing in forwards. So we're gonna go from back to front. And in my case here, since I'm on the engine stand is actually in the way of me accessing that rear bore. So if you don't have this on an engine stand or a different engine stand and you can get through to the back, no problem, then good, you're in good shape. For me, on the other hand, I'm gonna have to move the block just a little bit, and I'm gonna show you that now. So this is your standard Harbor Freight engine stand. And with the block upside down, if we take a look, that rear bore just isn't accessible. We're not gonna be able to drive it from back here because the stand is in the way. So what I'm going to do is actually rotate the engine block 90 degrees, and that's going to make that bore accessible to drive through, and I'll also still be able to easily see through from the bottom of the engine to see what we're doing. So I rotated the block just over to the next hole. I actually only turned it 45 degrees, and that gives you guys a nice view of the underside of the block. And if we take a look from the back, we can see that I still have a straight shot through the back of the block. So now we're just gonna take our cam bearing installation tool and feed it through the rear of the block. And that's really easy to do. For this tool, just pop the piece off. It just sits in there with a rubber O-ring that keeps it in place. I'll put this aside so I have a free hand. If you have this tool, make sure that this tapered piece is still facing forwards and that you didn't take it off and switch it around. And I'll show you why in a moment. Tapered piece facing the front of the block. So since we have all new cam bearings in there, we want to be very careful as we insert this tool because we don't want to bang or scrape any of our new bearings in any way that's going to damage them. So I'm going to take a moment to rest the tool down there as I get my hand in the right position. And I have the bar brought all the way up to the front here, as you can see. And I'll reach back over here, get the front piece, and just go ahead and snap that on. And then I'll back this up just a little bit so we can prepare to drive that front bearing in. Now remember I mentioned make sure that that tapered piece is facing the right way? Here's why. If you had accidentally installed this piece backwards, meaning that this side here was actually what was in the bore, this would be contacting the rear of your number 5 bearing. If you take a look here, with the tapered piece located in the back of the block, it's a little hard to see. Let's see if I can get you in there. It's not touching the back of the bearing. There's plenty of room. If you were to install it backwards and it were touching the back of the bearing, then when you go to drive your front bearing here in, you would end up inadvertently driving this number 5 bearing back out and into the block. And obviously we have those all installed in place where we need them to be, so we don't want to be moving this bearing again. So make sure that whatever tool you're using doesn't contact the back of this bearing if you're going this route through the back of the block. All right, so we're pretty much going to be doing exactly what we did with the previous bearings. I got the new bearing on the end of the tool. I have my line facing up where I can see it, and I'm all nice and lined up. So with that in position, I can get the tapered end here located into the back of the block. And I'm going to give it its first strike just to get it in place. Okay, it looks good. Okay, looking pretty close, so I'm going to back the tool off, put that down gently, and let's take a look. From what I can see, that looks like it's in far enough and looks pretty equal on each side. Looks nice from the front. Take the Allen key again. Drops right in. So I know that there won't be a blockage there either. And that's lined up with that groove. Nice. Then with the front bearing installed, this is a good opportunity to get a nice clear look at the Allen key trick. With it in the right spot, you can clearly tell when the Allen key actually drops through past the bearing and down into the groove. There's a lot more movement than when it's not in all the way and you actually end up just contacting the bore. So that's what you're looking for on the other bearings. All right, and I got the camshaft in to do our hopefully final inspection, and it's rotating just fine. Yep, that's good. So before we celebrate and consider this job complete, we're going to want to make sure that the engine block is nice and clean. Prior to the cam bearing installation, I did a full engine block cleaning. So I want to make sure that I didn't introduce any more debris or any new debris into the engine during the cam bearing installation. What can commonly happen is as you drive the new bearings in and they crush to fit into those bores, you can occasionally get very fine metal shavings that come off of the bearing. So what I'm going to do is take a magnet tool and just run it in between each cam bearing bore along the block, kind of where the lifter bores are, and pick up any loose debris that might potentially be sitting down there. After that, I'm going to take some solvent and my blowgun and I'll blow everything out. And I will not be satisfied until this is 100% squeaky clean again. So with the block nice and clean, I have everything coated with WD-40. You can also use ATF or oil, just to make sure that nothing rusts as the block sits while you wait to continue your assembly. So here we are again, except now we have some nice new shiny cam bearings installed, and this job is complete. So I hope this gave you guys some tips and insights on what it's like to do the cam bearing installation, but above all else, I hope this is giving you the confidence that you can do this yourself. The only special tool you really need is that cam bearing installation tool. And I'll put a link in the description below to the exact tool that I was using in case you guys want to check that one out. Otherwise, take your time, go nice and slow, make sure all your marks are lined up, and when it comes time to drive those bearings in, just do them a little bit at a time. Go slow. There's no need to go swinging for a home run with these. Tap them in a little bit at a time and keep checking your progress, and just sneak up on them being in the proper position. Eventually you'll see that they're sitting where they need to be, and you can do that Allen key trick and make sure that they're in the right spot. But above all else, just go slow and take your time. Don't overshoot anything. All right? So as always, thank you so much guys for watching. If you guys decide to tackle this yourself, leave me a comment below and let me know how it went. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And as always, have a good one. All right, that'll work. You can cut that. What's that? I'm talking to myself.